On behalf of the People's Conversation, I officially welcome our listeners to 2020. Not only is this the start of a new year, it's also the start of a new decade. With the level of technology getting better with each passing year, one can only wonder what the world will look like as we leave the previous decade behind and turn our eyes to the future promises of the new one. What can we expect to come over the next 10 years? Will space travel be a reality? Will politicians realize that they work for the people and not the other way around? Will the media recover from the partisan hackery that defined them in the previous decade? Will Apple finally run out of emojis to include in their products? While all worthy things to consider, the most important question in my mind is whether society and our social fabric will have recovered from the extreme leftism that consumed the Western world. Of course, this assumes that we all survive the coming climate apocalypse that experts have warned is just around the corner. Although I have heard many timeframes, it seems that 12 to 15 years is the most common period that is cited as a threshold we dare not cross. To help frame this episode, I think it's important to convey my current position, which is that climate change is real, the climate emergency is not, and I do not believe that climate change is man-made. I had planned on doing an episode on climate change later this year, but a recent Twitter debate that I was engaged in suggested there was no time like the present. To that end, I will go through the main talking points that make up the overall climate change narrative from our Liberal government, specifically the narrative and talking points of the former Environment Minister, Catherine McKenna. Climate change, or the pending climate emergency as the body politic likes to describe it, is one of the most polarizing topics currently in the public square, with some people who would rather talk about religion or abortion instead. Although the general topic has been around for several decades at this point, it really hit a fever pitch during the last decade and will likely only increase in the coming one as we draw closer to the point of no return. When you sift through all the various interviews, statements, and social media posts, the overall position of the Liberal government is reduced to the following: climate change is real, the science is settled, the chief cause of climate change is an abundance of CO2, the extreme weather, especially forest fires and flooding, are proof of climate change, and the last one is the Western world is the main cause and must act now to reduce emissions by putting a price on carbon. Before we move further, let's listen to perhaps her most famous interview around the Liberal position. This was an interview conducted by CTV, and I am going to include the whole interview to help provide some context for what comes next.
Is Canada's lofty plan to tackle climate change starting to get lost in the smog of facts? Well, a new audit by the Federal Environment Commissioner revealed Canada will fail to reach the 2030 climate targets set out in the Paris Accord. It was a damning report. Most provinces have not even established any targets to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and those that have them don't have a plan to reach them. Now, the federal government has responded and says the audit doesn't include their new plan. It looks backwards. But even their new plan at this point won't work. Add in the growing provincial opposition to the carbon tax or the price on carbon in places like Saskatchewan and Alberta and the main opposition parties in Ontario, trouble is brewing. So what will the government do to get on track or stay on track? Let's find out. The Environment Minister, Catherine McKenna, joins. I always say we've known each other long before you got into politics. That was a pretty, the report was damning. Let's say it. I know you say it's looking backwards, but the provinces don't have a plan to reach their targets. What are you going to do about it?
So I think, first of all, something that's really amazing about this report, first-time auditors general across the country looked at climate action. That's great because we know climate change has a huge cost. It's flooding people's homes, their forest fires. The Arctic is literally melting. But the report actually looked back. And I know that you said that, but it is true that it looked at the fact that there was no action under a decade of Stephen Harper. And she actually said, in terms of looking forward, that this is the most significant, best climate plan Canada's ever had, the one we negotiated with provinces and territories. And I've always said this, we're 100% committed to meeting our target, and we're working with provinces. We're phasing out coal, historic investments in public transportation that's improving people's lives, making investment in clean technology.
I think, though, there's also a credibility problem, frankly, because first of all, you're on target. They're the same targets of Stephen Harper. So on the left, and some of the progressives say the targets are not good enough anyway. And then the original date to hit the targets was 2020. Now we're 2030. We keep missing targets. Why should anyone believe you'll meet these new targets way off in the distance in 2030?
They should believe us because we're taking action. And for the first time ever, we had a plan. Like, we have not had a climate plan. So for people who say this is Stephen Harper's targets, if you have targets but you don't have a plan to meet them, it's worth nothing. Our emissions were going up when we came into government, and actually the UN report, it showed 200 megatons. That probably doesn't mean much to people. That's a significant drop in our emissions. So things take time, and hard things are hard.
I get that, but you're still missing targets.
But a 2020 target.
The economy's growing, they're still being missed. When you had the pan-climate agreement, the Canadian agreement on this, Alberta was saying, look, we'll do this. We'll accept your targets on emissions and your emissions caps, but in exchange for the Kinder Morgan pipeline. Now Alberta is saying, until we get that pipeline, because they're afraid it's going to be delayed to death, we're not going to act on that. What will your government do to ensure that that pipeline is actually built before the next election?
So, I mean, the pipeline is being built, and we've approved the pipeline. And I think it's also hard for some people can't understand. I'm the Minister of Environment and Climate Change. Why would I be supporting a pipeline? This fits within our climate plan, and also we're in a transition, so we have to be smart about this.
Don't skim over BC. It's an NDP premier who doesn't want it. There's Burnaby around Vancouver. They're challenging this in the Supreme Court. The mayors don't like it. I mean, you could say, oh, we want it, but you have not convinced the government or the people of BC to have this pipeline. They don't want it. And they're going to try to delay it and delay it and delay it until it dies. And Alberta knows that. What are you going to do to ensure that doesn't happen?
So as I said, the pipeline is being built. There was a decision. There was a decision by court once again that it can go ahead. We've said it's clearly in the federal government's jurisdiction.
And now, of course, the key is opponents of that pipeline are waiting and waiting, and then Rachel Notley will face an election against Jason Kenney, who doesn't want your price on carbon. So then that's the other piece. Jason Kenney, if he wins that election, he's going to oppose it. Doug Ford in Ontario, that's a very close election. If he becomes the Premier of Ontario, he will challenge it. What do you do about Doug Ford? What do you do about Jason Kenney?
You know what I do is I talk to Canadians, and Canadians want action on climate change. They know it's real. Like, whether you live in Alberta or BC and you've had huge forest fires, or you've been in Ontario, Quebec, you've had flooding. Like, we need to see action, and so Canadians overwhelmingly
based on that they oppose it. You can't say Canadians support it. If they elect Doug Ford, it's a big if, let's wait, but if they do, they will have elected him because he opposes that carbon tax or carbon price.
Well, first of all, people vote for many reasons in elections. I don't know what's going to happen in that election, but it doesn't matter. We've been clear. There is going to be a price on pollution across the country. 80% of Canadians live where there's a price on pollution. That was part of our climate plan.
How will you punish a province that tries to take you to court and won't do it? Yeah, because that's what would happen under Doug Ford. That's what would happen to Jason Kenney. And later on the program, we've got Brad Wall, the former Premier of Saskatchewan. They don't want to do it. What will the government do?
Well, they'll lose in court. Manitoba looked at this issue. They got an opinion, and the opinion said it's well within the federal government's jurisdiction to put a price on what we don't want, pollution. But let's be clear, like, climate change has huge costs now. I have no time for folks who are like, we shouldn't take action.
What do you mean you have no time? You got to have time. You got it. Well, your job is to have time for folks that care about this issue and want to understand it.
I don't have time for politicians that play cynical games about climate action. The cost right now is in the billions of dollars.
But politicians have priorities. You got to have. This is the problem that people say the liberal smack of arrogance. Your job is to have time for people who disagree with you.
I have time for Canadians who disagree with me, and I have conversations with them all the time. I meet with people. I meet with businesses.
Elected leaders are Canadians. You know that.
But I don't have time for politicians who pretend that climate change isn't real. Well, how can we do this? I have 3 kids. People have kids.
Who says that?
Well, if you have no,
they're not saying that.
If you have
they're saying
no
they don't like the mechanism
plan,
for you to deal with it.
No, actually, so let's be clear, in the provincial election, the Ontario provincial election, we had 4 leadership candidates. In the Conservative leadership election, no one had a climate plan. Not one of them. How depressing is that? That I don't know, maybe they believe in climate change, but if they're not going to take action, how are they going to help save this planet? And at the end of the day, it's about our kids. It is about making sure they have a sustainable future and that we're all working together. That's why I get frustrated when when you have politicians who don't want to do anything. They have no plan. It's easy to say you don't like one piece of the plan. No, you actually have to have an overall plan, and they don't put up anything. They don't want to take action, and we don't have a choice. We already see the impacts of climate change across the board. Canadians know that.
All right, I got to leave it there. Happy Easter, by the way.
Thank you very much.
Have a good Easter on Easter Sunday. Thanks so much.
There are a few points that she makes in this interview that we'll touch on later, but the key point that I want to highlight right now is what is referred to as liberal arrogance, which McKenna clearly illustrates as she preaches about not having time for deniers and gets called out on it. I think what she really means is that she has no time to have an intelligent debate whereby she must defend the position that the government is taking with rational and cogent thought, which would require her to justify how a new tax is the answer to a question that very few people agree with. Before we go much further, I think we need to define what the word climate means so that there is a common reference point to draw upon. A quick search reveals the following. Climatology or climate science is the scientific study of climate, scientifically defined as weather conditions averaged over a period of time. This modern field of study is regarded as a branch of the atmospheric sciences and a subfield of physical geography. When I read this, my first thought was, what exactly does long-term mean? When I tried to get a sense of what the various scientists were using, I was surprised to learn that there wasn't a standard. The period of time used can swing anywhere from 1,000 years to 30 years, although 50 to 100 years seems to be the most common. Additionally, most scientists also reference the year 1880 as the starting point of their statements, which is presumably due to when rudimentary data is available. However, this presents the first problem. With no universally accepted measurement of time with which to frame the research, how can the scientific community come to consensus relative to data? Indeed, the resulting models being used can be significantly different depending on how the data is curated and processed relative to time. In the end, this doesn't matter relative to the first assertion, which is climate change is real. Our planet is a complex biosphere where many discrete systems are at work. Change is a constant, nothing is fixed in time, nor is it stagnant. So, therefore, climate change by definition is real. With the first point conceded, let's move on to the second point, which is the science is settled. This is one of the more peculiar statements that Minister McKenna has made, as this point seems to shift in context between climate change and climate emergency. Since many have conceded the point that climate change is real, I can only assume that the context for this statement relates to the climate emergency. Is the science settled? It certainly doesn't appear to be. For every group of scientists that says it's real, there's another group that says it isn't. I'm going to examine two stories to highlight the differences in accepted mainstream narrative, and then talk about what I have seen in my own research. The first article was published by the Washington Times on September 29, 2019, entitled, "There is no climate emergency, hundreds of scientists, engineers tell UN." The story describes a letter that was sent to the UN, which was signed by 500 scientists and engineers, stating that there is no climate emergency and the UN should stop inciting fear and instead make policy on what they called sound science. This story didn't get too much coverage at the time, as most of the media were too busy fawning over Greta Thunberg. However, there were some responses from a variety of groups and media outlets who opposed the story, citing two main reasons that they perceived. Number one, there were very few climatologists that were part of the group who signed it. Therefore, there was a lack of substance from the subject matter experts. Number two, it was argued that the climatologists who did sign it made up part of the 3% of the world's climatologists who were in denial. The implication being that the often cited number of 97% of all scientists believing in climate change being true, and therefore the debate is over. This was a clear message to the people who signed this letter that they, and the letter itself, lacked any and all credibility and should be ignored. It's important to note that some of the responses were harsh. Just do some Googling and you'll see what I mean. The second article was published by the CBC on November 5, 2019, entitled 11,000 Scientists Sign Declaration of Climate Emergency. This article was seen in a very different light and garnered much more coverage across the Western world, with that coverage being very positive. When I first read the headline back in November, I immediately brushed it off and ignored it, mostly because it was being reported by the CBC. However, as part of the research for this episode, I decided to revisit it and give it a fair reading. My first thought while going through the article was, 11,000 people was a lot, and I wonder who they were. Since there was a link to the website in question, I decided to visit it. It didn't take me too long to find a rather inconvenient problem. As I scrolled through the first 3 pages of those who signed on to this, I found that only one person for sure, perhaps two, who seemed to be legitimate climatologists. The others who signed were from other branches of science, like physics, biology, botany, and one appeared to be an economist. Do you see some irony yet? So, let's do some elementary school math here on a small sample set. There were approximately 12 scientists per page, and since I only viewed 3 pages, that means a total of 36 scientists. Out of those 36, with only 2 being actual climatologists means that only 5.5% of the sample size of 36 were subject matter experts. If we extend this percentage to the whole of the 11,000 signatories, then that means that only 605 are likely climatologists. Now, this number is probably lower when you consider that Mickey Mouse signed, and there was at least one advocacy group that was reported to have signed as well. When put in context, this changes the narrative quite substantially. Not only is the 11,000 number grossly misleading, but when you apply the same standard of criteria to this group of people that the opposition said for the first group of people back in September, then both must be viewed as not being credible and summarily be dismissed. What would have been helpful is that if both sides would have only included actual and verified climate scientists, then at least one could infer the support of one perspective relative to the other. Compounding this, of course, was the wholesale adoption and glowing coverage by the media over the latter, while rebuking the former. Once again, the media fails in its obligation to inform and to not be partisan. Now, let's remove the media from the equation and look at some specifics. I visited many climate change blogs and websites that span both sides of the debate, and was actually quite surprised by what I found. Although much of the science was over my head, a clear picture was emerging which centered on three themes. Number one, there's a lot of debate. Further, there were times when people on both sides of the debate not only acknowledged the other side's perspective, but that acknowledgement usually ended with a common statement, which was more research is needed. Number two, I also learned that most of the research seems to be centered around causation relative to energy imbalances and radiative forcing. It was quite interesting to read, at least the parts that I understood, and shows that scientists are debating the merits of the facts and always trying to put those facts in context to the larger whole. Number three, the community on these websites seemed to agree on three things. Climate change has several inputs, which are surface albedo or reflectivity, ozone, solar variations, planet positioning relative to the sun, volcanoes, aerosols, stratospheric water vapor, and various greenhouse gases. There is much more to this than just CO2. There is not nearly enough understanding of all the variables and their interactions to form a truly effective model of the climate. Although computer models are somewhat helpful, they need to mature much more before they can be useful. This maturity can only happen when a more broad-based understanding occurs. Further, although much more research is required before good policy can be engineered, it is, however, a good idea to change policies around those things that we already know are harmful, such as CFCs and other chemical compounds like DDT, and this speaks much more to environmental policy than to climate policy. Finally, there is a clear disappointment with how governments have politicized the research for their own goals and have constructed policy without the consensus that they routinely claim is there. This is a very different perspective from what Minister McKenna, along with the political left, including the media, have proclaimed. They would have us believe that the debates are over, a new tax is the answer, and we need to accept this and move on. However, some simple research and a commitment to read clearly illustrates the opposite is true. Let's move on to the next point, which is, the chief cause of climate change is an abundance of CO2. This one is challenging not in so much to the statement, which appears to be true, but to the causation. There were times in Earth's history when the concentration of CO2 was orders of magnitude higher than it is today, and the environmental impact was glaciation. In other time periods, high levels of CO2 caused warming, and as I'm sure you can imagine, man wasn't a factor. I think this goes back to the commentary above, which is that the climate is a complex process, and reducing that process to just the concentrations of atmospheric CO2 alone is incorrect. Just because there is an abundance of CO2 doesn't mean something negative relative to our climate, and this becomes dangerous when government makes policy decisions based solely on one input that can impact the climate and not taking all the inputs into consideration. Moving on to the next point. The extreme weather, especially forest fires and flooding, are proof of climate change. This is really a great example of what is wrong with the whole topic of climate change. This is politics and nothing more. For example, on May 26, 2019, the CBC published an article entitled, "As Wildfires Burn, Environment Minister McKenna Blasts Provincial Tories for Scrapping Carbon Tax." The article is essentially Minister McKenna ripping on Jason Kenney for scrapping the carbon tax and points to the raging wildfires as evidence of climate change. She is quoted in the article as saying, "Alberta is facing several out-of-control wildfires, a scenario that researchers say will become more common as warmer climate conditions lead to earlier and more intense wildfire seasons." As we will see, this isn't accurate, and of course, there is no mention of how the carbon tax would have prevented these fires in the first place. Further, there are a few unfortunate truths here. Number one, nowhere are these researchers identified. Indeed, Minister McKenna is infamous for citing researchers and experts, but conveniently never gets around to detailing who these people are. Therefore, the reader is left to assume that her claims are accurate and truthful, which is ironic considering that this is the same Catherine McKenna who was caught on video saying, "The more you tell a lie, the more that people will believe it." However, I did come across one article on the Government of Canada Climate Change website by Megan Kirchmeier-Young, who is a research scientist for Environment and Climate Change Canada, saying, as the climate continues to warm, we can expect that costly extreme wildfire seasons like 2017 in BC will become more likely in the future. This will have increasing impact on many sectors, including forest management, public health, and infrastructure. I guess this may be one of the sources that Minister McKenna relies upon. Number 2, as most of us know, the wildfires turned out to be the result of arson, not climate change. The CBC didn't retract the article or make an amendment to it, nor did Minister McKenna retract her comments or issue a statement of clarity. The path chosen was to leave her initial claims, which were proved false and backed by the media, to be preserved as fact for history to see. There are more examples of similar situations, including proclamations that recent flooding was due to climate change as well, only for many people to point out that the areas in question were known floodplains which had been flooding on and off for centuries. There are more examples of Minister McKenna's alarmism, but I think you get the point. Finally, let's talk about the last point, which is, the Western world is the main cause and must act now to reduce emissions by putting a price on carbon. Let's start with the Western world is the main cause. This is patently false. According to the 2014 data from Statistics Canada of the top 10 emitters, China occupies the top spot at 26%, with the US coming in second at 13.9%. In fact, when you tally up the emissions from all the countries that make up the Western world, the total emissions are 24.4%, which is still less than China. Factor in India, who is fourth on the list at 6.7%, and the total of those two countries is 32.7%, which is 34.01% higher than the entirety of the Western world. Where does Canada rank in this listing? We are number 9 at 1.6%. Let's compare the 2014 data to the 2005 data, again from Statistics Canada. When the data is compared, there are some significant trends that emerge. The first trend is that the emissions of China and India are up significantly, and the emissions of the Western world are down significantly. Total emissions of the Western world in 2005 were 32.8%, and in 2014 they were reduced to 24.4%, which is a decrease of almost 35%, with the largest reduction being 27.3% by the United States. Canada's emissions have decreased from 1.8% to 1.6%, and some would argue that this makes Canada's contribution statistically insignificant. China's emissions have increased from 19% in 2005 to 26% in 2014, which is a 36.7% increase, and India has increased from 5.1 to 6.7, or 31.37%. It would seem to me that the Western world is in fact taking action, as emissions have decreased by 34.4% over the past 9 years and continue to decline, while the largest emitters continue to raise their emissions. Also, it's important to note that China and India, who are the largest emitters, are not subject to the Paris Accords, but the Western world is. This is absurd in the extreme, and those two countries alone could easily explain the overabundance of CO2 and other greenhouse gases that is so often cited as the reason action must be taken. However, like other areas of public debate in the area of socialist liberalism, the dogma insists that these facts can't be talked about and we must listen to government who knows best. Also important to note that the United States is taking steps to withdraw from the Paris Accords and should be fully out in 2020. The main reason cited by the US was that China, India, and other countries outside of the Western world weren't bound by the agreement, and therefore the agreement was flawed. Let's move on to the carbon tax. As soon as I hear the government state that it needs to introduce a new tax, I instinctively clutch my wallet. There are many examples in my lifetime of government, at all levels, going to the people and insisting that a new tax is the only way to solve the perceived issue of the day. The end result has been, without fail, that the revenue generated by said tax gets diverted into general revenue and is then used for spending elsewhere. One only has to read the various Auditor General reports at both the provincial and federal levels over the decades to see this in action. If you really want to see some fiscal sleight of hand, then look no further to the AG reports from Ontario during the last 15 years of Liberal policies. The carbon tax has been positioned as a revenue-neutral tax that will be used to fight climate change. There are several problems with this, least of which is that it's impossible for such a tax, which is based on consumption, to ever be revenue-neutral, as the inputs required to calculate neutrality can never be known. The other issue is that I have yet to hear exactly how this tax will be used to fight climate change. The only thing I've heard from government is various talking points that some of the money will be spent on green initiatives and research, both of which are very ambiguous and lack any form of substance. Perhaps more important, though, is that if only some of the money will be spent this way, where is the rest of the money going? Finally, why is there a need to introduce the carbon tax at all? The stated goal of the tax is tackling climate change by way of changing social behavior to reduce emissions to zero. Let's forego the topic that it's always a bad idea for government to try and change social behavior and focus on the intent of the tax. By the government's own data, Canada is steadily reducing its emissions on our own without government intervention, whereby India's emissions have increased 1.6% from 2005 to 2014 and is continuing to trend upwards. Put another way, India's 9-year increase equals the whole of Canada's emissions. How will the imposition of a financially burdensome consumption tax on Canadians make a meaningful impact on CO2 emissions when the number 4 emitter has already surpassed Canada's total emissions? I started this episode by stating what my current position on this topic is. So the question invariably becomes, has my position changed? And the answer is somewhat. What has not changed is that I still think climate change is real and the climate emergency is not, and the reasons for this are still the same. The climate is always changing, and the climate emergency is a made-for-government solution to justify the creation of a new revenue stream to support out-of-control spending. I also still think that the position of government relative to the climate emergency is nonsense, and as time goes on, the narrative that has been created will collapse in on itself. Once that happens, either the people will fight back, or the government, backed by the media, will change the narrative in some way, and then it will be repackaged with a new marketing campaign, similar to what happened to global warming. Further, the vast majority of the data uses 1880 as a starting point, which gives us a window of approximately 140 years. This window of time is not large enough to truly draw meaningful information from it as it's too narrow. Some acknowledge this directly, and others disagree, citing that effective numbers can be extrapolated from core samples which span the fossil record. Who knows? Maybe they're right, but there is certainly no consensus on this. My own view is that using a 140-year window into a planet that has been around for some 4.6 billion years seems blatantly flawed. Even if we just go back to the major periods of life within the fossil record, we are still talking some 500 million years, which means we are basing the science in terms of real, quantifiable data on a sample size that equates to 0.0000028% of the major time periods where animal life appears to be abundant. However, I do have a new position on 2 items. Is climate change man-made? No. Is man innocent? Certainly not. But the question now becomes how much man is contributing to the problem, and honestly, I have no idea, and I don't think the scientists do either. There are certainly some who consider the answer to this obvious on both sides of the debate, but it seems the majority haven't drawn absolute conclusions either way, and these are the same folks who say much more data and research is needed. They also believe that to create policies based on the limited and disputed data to date is very premature and irresponsible. I also think that many people are confusing climate change with environmentalism. I make this statement as one of the themes that emerged from my Twitter exchanges and general conversations over the holidays was that people were citing all forms of malfeasance from corporations and governments. I in turn conceded on every one of them as the points that were being made by these people were true. However, these events are not proof of climate change or a climate emergency. There is no doubt that humans across the world have done a poor job of being good stewards of the environment, which most consider a sacred trust. From Quebec dumping millions of liters of raw sewage into the St. Lawrence, to China's air quality issues, to the homeless crisis in the state of California, to the Enron disaster. All these things are examples of where humanity has made poor choices, and this is just the tip of the iceberg. These events and others like them culminate into what could be deemed an environmental crisis, which I think people could get behind and help bring about meaningful change in this regard. However, this wouldn't bring in the billions of dollars that overspending governments across the Western world need, so therefore, what could be legitimately called a crisis remains on the fringe in the national discussion, and much like the gun debate, governments will continue to focus on the wrong things, while the real issues continue to worsen. There is one other topic that I want to talk about, and that is the overall approach of government. My biggest problem with this whole topic isn't the science or even the social media commentary, although some of that has been disturbing. It's been the various governments and politicians who have proclaimed a climate emergency and the media that dutifully supported it. I must believe that if there was truly a climate emergency whereby the world will end in whatever time frame is being touted, or if we are about to cross a magical threshold that will irreparably harm the planet, then there would be more happening to avert this catastrophe. For instance, why haven't governments instituted austerity measures to stop emissions? Why haven't car companies been told to either dramatically reduce or fully halt production of gasoline engines? Why haven't all the OPEC nations reduced or stopped oil productions? Why won't the carbon tax be applied to oil imported from Saudi Arabia, but the tax will be applied to Alberta's oil production? Why haven't all available resources been poured into creating a new, sustainable source of energy that is cost-effective for everyone? Why are issues like the gender pay gap, transgenderism, or the host of other social justice nonsense still center stage? If the world is ending, how do these things matter? If climate change has resulted in the ongoing melting of the polar ice caps, then why has Canada commissioned for the construction of 6 new icebreakers? Surely they won't be needed, and those taxpayer dollars could be used elsewhere. Most importantly is why haven't all world governments come together like never before to address this issue head on? The only solution governments have offered to what they say is the most existential crisis of our time is to pitch a price on carbon along with the ability to purchase carbon offsets to ease your conscience, and of course, the wholesale destruction of Alberta's economy. That's the plan. Either the governments of the world, and especially our own, must be the most incompetent people to ever hold public office, or there is no climate emergency, and as most people believe, this is nothing more than a way for governments to generate additional revenues to support egregious spending. For example, what happens when Canada reaches its goals of net zero emissions? Does the carbon tax disappear, and the government will tell us, job well done? I doubt anyone believes that this tax, once fully implemented, will ever be removed. The reality is that the government, in concert with the media, has used this debate to drive fear and anxiety into the national psyche to force the people to willingly accept a new consumption tax, nothing more. This will only continue into 2020 and beyond, and I suspect this will reach new heights as we near the 2020 US presidential election in November. We already see an elevated discourse of rhetoric from the various Democrat hopefuls, and this is just the beginning. Politicians always prey upon the fears of the people to get elected and advance their specific agenda, and, much like the recent 2019 election cycle in Canada, the 2020 election cycle in the US will see this process be expanded upon. The losers, of course, will be the people and the continued erosion of common sense and good government. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I would like to thank you for listening. Please give us a like and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and if you're listening to this on YouTube, please also click the notification bell so you'll be notified when there is a new episode. If you have suggestions, comments, or would like to express constructive feedback, please drop us an email at mailbag@thepeoplesconversation.ca. We always enjoy hearing from our listeners, even those that disagree with us. Also, please visit our Patreon page and donate to the show. Your donation will help us to do more and will expand the content that we are able to provide. Finally, always remember that a country without basic freedoms, especially freedom of speech, is a country without a future. Until next time, stay safe and be well.